Welcome, everybody. I'm Nick Stewart. For those that are less familiar, I've been a freelance ecologist for quite a long time, and have a particular interest in aquatic vegetation, which I've been looking at for several decades. And during that time, I've seen quite a lot of changes occurring in aquatic flora. One of the problems has always been that there are rather few people that look at aquatic plants, and it means that the information is less complete for aquatic communities than it is for a lot of terrestrial habitats. So this is one of a suite of webinars that I've been giving to the BSBI, and today we're going to look at part of one of the larger families, the broad-leaved pondweeds. So pondweeds belong in a family of more or less their own. There are some satellite ones, genus with. So there are 21 species of Possum Coloratus, although 2 of these have just recently been separated off into a separate genus called Stipple Length. But for a lot of people, still using Possum pectinatus and Possum filiformis. And there's also a closely related one species of Greenlandia. But just to illustrate the number of the picture here shows the number of records for the different for the main species of pondweeds, and 2 species, Possum natans and Possum Coloratus, account for more than half the records of Possum in the BSBI database. So all the others, so that's 20 species, account for this red area here, and it just shows that it's partly because those 2 species are quite common, of course, but there is a tendency for them to, but they're also easily recorded, and there's a tendency for them to be recorded much better, and the other ones people tend to shy away from much more. So this is particular reason for concentrating on this family. For books, the best book available is the BSBI Handbook Pondweeds. It's a bit faded, this cover here, which is a very excellent and thorough book, which tells you lots of information about the species. On the whole, a lot of the color guides are not so good, so I would certainly recommend that. A couple of other useful sources. The plant crib takes a number of the more difficult sections of the pondweeds and goes into more detail, and with various tables and what characters to particularly look out for. Also, similarly, Richard Lansdowne's guide to river plants, although directed mainly at rivers, a lot of the species are common to standing waters too. So it also has a lot of useful tips for identifying pondweeds. Also available, these are available on the BSBI's Aquatic Plant Project website, a set of keys that I've developed over the years, particularly for training courses, and they're designed to be on sort of A4 sheet that you can sort of print off and laminate, and you can take them out in the field. So there's one here for the broad-leaved pondweeds, which we're talking about today, but there are a lot of other useful useful keys available on the website. So pondweeds come in a variety of different shapes and sizes, but they all have two features in common. The Potamogetons and Stickenia all have alternate leaves. Greenlandia has opposite leaves, but for the most part, this group has alternate leaves, and also they have stipules. Stipules are a sort of tube or flap of tissue which are at the base of the leaf where it joins the stem, and they initially cover, protect the growing shoot, but as the plants grow, they tend to break away from that. And that combination of alternate leaves and stipules takes you immediately to Potamogeton. There aren't any other things that have that combination of characters. The pondweeds, it's one of the larger aquatic families, and they divide quite neatly into two groups, the narrow-leaved pondweeds and the broad-leaved pondweeds that we're talking about today. Now, the separation is essentially that the narrow leaves are less than a centimetre wide, and the broad-leaved ones are more than a centimetre wide, but there are some ones around 1 centimetre which you might place in either direction. And essentially the second difference is that the narrow-leaved ones are parallel-sided, sort of strap-shaped leaves, whereas the broad-leaved pondweeds are widest in the middle and narrow towards both ends. And just a couple of species that often have leaves that are around about a centimetre or even a bit more. First of all, the curled pondweed, Potamogeton crispus, which is very distinctive in that it has quite obvious teeth. You can sometimes see these with the naked eye, but they're certainly very easy to see under a hand lens. Not always this wavy edge that gives it its name, but essentially this is a strap-shaped one, so I will be including those in another webinar on the narrow-leaved pondweeds. Another feature of curled pondweed is that the stem is compressed if you take a cross-section through it, and that's another feature of the narrow-leaved pondweeds. They all have sort of oval cross-section or even flatter cross-sections to the stem, whereas the broad-leaved pondweeds all have circular cross-sections. One other one, this is a very rare species that occurs in the Hebrides in Scotland and as an introduction in a canal in Lancashire. It's called American pondweed and has leaves which can be about a centimetre, but they're very obviously long strap-shaped leaves. So again, I'll be covering those in the narrow-leaved pondweeds. So the broad-leaved pondweeds are more than a centimetre wide and narrowing at both ends, that gives us 9 species that are in the broad-leaved pondweed group, 9 species of Potamogeton and Greenlandia, which also I'll be covering today. So in the broad-leaved pondweeds, there are 2 types of leaves that you're going to come across. There are the opaque floating leaves that float on the water surface and have cuticle, and the translucent leaves that grow under the water within the water column. If you, it's like looking through stained glass. They're sort of translucent. I'm going to deal initially with the ones that only produce these opaque floating leaves, or that they appear to be just those are the only leaves present. This is complicated. Don't worry about it too much. I'll go into the bring out the key points in a moment. This is part of the key that you can download from the website, from the BSBI website. So essentially, the things that you look at. Sorry, just to go back to there. Essentially, we're dealing with 2 common species and a rarer species, which I'll come to in a second, but I want to concentrate initially on these 2, which are, as I said before, they're common species and account for more than half the records in the BSBI database. So it's worth spending a bit of time just discussing how to separate the 2. The first thing to look out for is in Polygon natans, just underneath the leaf, where the stem, the leaf stalk joins the leaf. Just here, you can see that there's a sort of up to ½ centimeter of slightly discolored, different colored bit of stem. You can see it here too. And this is a sort of flexible bit of stem, which allows the plant to put the leaf on wherever fits best on the surface of the water when it comes up to the surface. That flexible node is a feature only in Polygon natans. It never appears in other species with floating leaves. There, for comparison, there's Polygon polygynifolius. You can see that rather than having a bend where that flexible bit of stem is, the stalk runs sort of smoothly into the leaf, and often you can actually see that from a distance out in the water. You can sort of see that there's quite the leaves on pop natans are pointing in a sort of different direction from the stalk. Stipple length is another character which is quite useful. Polynesians has very long stipules. You can see here they always more than 4 centimeters long. They're acute and often quite stiff and a bit cloudy. Whereas Polynesian, there is overlap in length, but they're definitely much smaller and obtuse and tend to be a bit more floppy. Another useful character which you can do, you just need one leaf washed up at the edge, and you can still tell between them. The veins in Polygon natans, in the common pondweed, are it's not terribly clear in this picture, but the veins are quite translucent, particularly if you hold them up to the light. These longitudinal veins are like sort of translucent hairs running up and down the leaf. And the cross veins, there are cross veins if you get a good strong lens on, but they're pretty obscure. They're not very easy to see. Whereas the veins on Polynesian tend to be much more similar, or even a little darker than the rest of the leaf. And the cross veins are much more, you can see there's a sort of network of veins sort of going diagonally across the leaf, between the between the longitudinal veins, and they're much more obvious in Polygon. So it's another really quite useful character. Another if they're flowering, usually by this stage you already know which it is, but if for any particular reason there's an element of doubt, the fruit size of its flowering is also another useful character with quite a clear difference in the range of diameter of the fruits. So just to recap, Possum-eaten natans, it's got this flexible joint at the top of the petiole of the leaf stalk. The veins are paler than the lamina, and the cross veins are more or less obscure. And it has these long stalks, stipules, and large fruits. And in Polynesian, it doesn't have the flexible joint. It's got veins darker or the same color as the leaf, and cross veins are much more obvious in the smaller stipules and fruits. Now, I do need to say that Possum-eaten natans does produce underwater leaves. It doesn't appear so at first glance, but what it produces in the way of underwater leaves are these very long, they're called phyllodes. Essentially, they look like leaf stalks without a blade on the tip. And they're often quite long, and they're sort of solid in texture. And that's another distinctive feature of Possum-eaten natans. If you spot them, and can be quite confusing if you get it, particularly you have a young plant where it hasn't reached the surface and there are no floating leaves present, and you have something that looks pretty much like a narrow-leaf pondweed, except it's got very solid leaves. But these phyllodes can be quite confusing, so just need to be aware of that. Possum-eaten Polynesian very commonly occurs without any underwater leaves, but it can produce them, particularly in young plants before they reach the water surface. They're translucent leaves, so I will be covering those sort of later in the talk when we're talking about the translucent leaved species. But one of the features to particularly look out for is the long leaf stalks, which helps to separate it from other species. Now, the third one in that table is Possum-eaten Coloratus. It's very typically a plant with these translucent underwater leaves, but in certain conditions, particularly in quite shallow conditions, you can have plants that only have opaque leaves. But this is not that common. It does occur, but and often the leaves are not fully opaque, though you can see there's a little bit of translucence to, but worth covering here just because there are these occasions where you just get these semi-opaque leaves. And the thing to feature to look out for are the leaf stalks of both the floating leaves or these sort of opaque leaves and the underwater leaves are much shorter, usually much shorter than the leaf blade. Can be a bit longer in winter, so you need to be a bit careful with overwintering plants. Often the leaves are, again, in both types, are often broadest, sort of about a third of the way up rather than in the middle of the leaf. And the petiole is often wider at the top than it is at the bottom. But there can be times where it's quite difficult to be sure that it's between Polynesian and Coloratus. So I've seen, and in fact saw one last week, a population where I was sort of hovering between the two, and actually both species have actually been recorded from this ditch. So I think it was called Coloratus, but the characters, it had much longer petioles than normal. But if you have fruiting material, then you can easily separate them because there's a size difference between the diameter of the fruits. But of course, a lot of the time you don't have the fruit, so there may be times where you just have to say, I don't know. In terms of leafination, this is Coloratus here. Again, the veins are similar to Polynesian. They're sort of the same color or darker than the leaf, and it has obvious cross veins. There tends to be more, the veins, the cross veins in Coloratus tend to be a bit more horizontal, whereas these tend to be more ascending, but that's a difficult character to separate. And you see near the midrib here, they're quite ascending, but they sort of become more horizontal as they go towards the edge of the leaf. Another feature, particularly of Coloratus, is that often the leaves are distinctly sort of decurrent onto the top of the leaf stalk. So not on every leaf, but certainly some of the leaves often have sort of a little bit of tissues continuing down the top of the stalk. So that covers the species that you'll find or appear only to have floating leaves. There are 3 other species that produce floating leaves. These floating leaves are often pretty similar to those of Polynesian, in terms of venation and things. And if you had the leaves on their own, you'd have difficulty separating them. But all 3 of these produce translucent underwater leaves, which are much easier to use. So if you have a choice of leaves, go for the translucent leaves. They're much more useful for and easier to separate, and just ignore the floating leaves. A word of caution though, if you, particularly in sort of reservoirs where the water levels dropped, you can have, you can get plants that have the translucent leaves that get beached. And here you can see there's a sort of network of these dried leaves, underwater leaves, which can actually start breaking up, and you're left with these will root, and you'll just have these little tufts of the opaque leaves sitting on the mud, and you could easily confuse them for Polynesian, for the bold pondweed, particularly when these leaves have sort of broken up and blown away. So do be careful with that. So we move on to the leaves, the species that have translucent underwater leaves. And these are quite easy to separate, just based on 2 key characters, which are the leaf tip and the leaf base. And those 2, a combination of those characters will take you to 1 or 2 possibilities, and then you can just look at a few key characters to separate those. So what you're looking for are the leaf tips, whether the leaves are acute, usually quite sharply acute, or whether the leaves are obtuse or rounded. Now, the thing to just sort of sometimes people get caught out on, this one, which is Possum Alpinus, the leaves are sort of in overall form are quite acute, but what you're looking at is the actual tip. You can see that the actual tip is quite sort of obtuse or even a bit rounded. And so you're looking at right at the tip and not the sort of general form lower down. And at the leaf bases, what you're looking for is whether they're quite rounded at the base, sometimes even clasping the stem, whether they're sort of tapered at the base, or whether they've got a stalk. Often quite tapered into the stalk, but sometimes they can be quite abruptly. The base can be quite abruptly, but you can see it's not a long stalk, but there's a sort of distinct stalk to the leaf here. So based on those two characters, you can separate them into one or two species, and I'll go into a bit more detail some of the other characters to look for in these, and what I will do is I'll work down, I'll start with the acute tipped leaves ones, and work down the sort of top to bottom, and then the obtuse or rounded tipped ones, and again work top to bottom. So we'll start with this one here. So we've got acute tips and rounded bases, and this is the one non-pondweed, non-Possum eaten in this group. It's called Greenlandia densa, opposite-leaved pondweed, and as its English name implies, the leaves, rather than being staggered, they're opposite, in sort of pairs going up stem. I should have perhaps said that you do have to be slightly careful, because although in pondweed most of the leaves are alternate, just underneath the flower head you will find a pair of leaves which are opposite, which basically help to for the plant to balance the flower head, which will stick up out of the water. If it was just propped up on one side by a leaf, it would sort of tip over, but it's got two leaves and it just balances so that the flower can stick up out of the water. But this is quite a rare species, becoming ever more so. It's protected in Ireland, and it has seriously declined in Britain too. So it's always a nice species to find, but increasingly rare to find that. So again, the next box on things. So we've got the leaf tip acute, and the leaf base is tapered and without a stalk. And the only option here is the variously pondweed Polynesian gramineus, which is quite a small leaved one. In the discussion at the beginning about what's a narrow leaf, these leaves, or some of these leaves, tend to be about 1 centimetre wide. So you might sort of say, oh, is this a narrow leaf one? But you can see that the leaves are tapered at both ends. They're not sort of strap shaped. They're definitely widest in the middle and narrower at the ends. This is very commonly quite curly and curled leaves like this, very typical of Polynesian gramineus. Another thing that's quite distinctive is that it has these very sort of stiff, small stipules, tend to be about 1 centimetre long, and often they sort of pull away from the stem like this and roll into a point. And that's quite a distinctive feature of gramineus. Stipules are quite a useful secondary character. You'll see that we'll be discussing stipules in several of these species as being a useful character that for sort of to support the decision you made from the leaf tip and the leaf bases. So that's the only one with pointed tips and taper bases. But the next one is quite closely related, but differs in there's a distinct stalk, often quite a short, just sort of less than a centimetre of stalk at the base of the leaf. But it's usually quite easy to separate anyway, because it's a much larger plant with big glossy leaves. The shining pondweed is aptly named, and often the quite obvious sort of network of veins on, across the leaf. It's one of two species that have acute tips and leaves stalked. We'll come to the other one in a moment. But the main feature of this is that the petioles, the leaf stalks are quite short, slightly more than a centimetre at most, but sometimes really you have to look quite hard. And particularly compared to Gramineus, the stipules are much longer, sort of up to about sort of 6, 7, 8 centimeters long, and they have a very obvious keel, a sort of flange, two keels along the length of the stipule. So which is quite unusual. So sometimes you have a sort of quite strong veins, but it's unusual to have an obvious flange. The other species that has pointed leaves and stalks is a rare species. Occurs in a few rivers in southern England. It's called Loddon Pondweed after the river that the main river that it occurs in. It's one of the ones that produces floating leaves, and these are quite often present. But the main feature that separates it from Polynesian loose ends is that the leaves are very long stalked, sort of more than 7 centimeters long. So very obviously stalked leaves. Stipules are also quite long, as in loose ends, but they don't have those ridges along the keels. I'm afraid this picture is not a brilliant picture, but just it does show nicely the long stalks. So those 4 are the ones with the acute tips. If we move on to the ones that have rounded tips or obtuse tips, so the first group, it has rounded bases as well as the tips, and there are 2 species in this group, which are Polynesian foliatus and Polynesian prolongus. And the easiest separation between them, I mean, often there's much more oval leaf in shorter and oval leaf in Foliatus, but the very easy character is that the stipules on Foliatus they start off very small. They're only sort of at most sort of half a centimeter long, and they disappear very quickly. So it is one pondweed that most of the time you will think it doesn't have any stipules at all. You have to look really quite hard in amongst the young leaves at the tip of the stem to actually see the stipules, and they're very sort of small and translucent, and as I say, they disappear very quickly. Whereas in Polynesian prolongus, you can see the stipules much more obvious, and they persist right till the end of, even when the plants are decaying, you'll still have fibrous stipules visible. Another feature of this one is sometimes in Foliaceae you'll have a sort of slightly hooded tip to the leaf. This one is always just distinctly hooded. So it's got a little sort of cap at the tip. If you press the specimens in the herbarium very distinctively, because of that hooded tip, they often have a little split when they're pressed, where the hood's been sort of flattened out. So usually, if you look at a herbarium specimen of Prelongus, has this sort of split at the tip. But again, we got the rounded bases and the sort of obtuse rounded tips of this group. So another picture of the stipules there. They can be quite long, but the leaves also tend to be much longer than in Perfoliatus. There tends to be sort of more oblong lanceolate rather than elliptical. Just a note in passing, why is it called long-stalk pondweed? That's to do with the flower stalk. It's not to do with the leaf. Leaf is completely sessile. There's no stalk. So on to the next box. So we got leaf tips rounded or obtuse, but you can see that the leaves here are tapered at the base. And the only one in this box is Polynesian Alpinus, the red pondweed. And it's another one that produces floating leaves, but often the base of the leaf of the floating leaves is often quite translucent. You tend to have a sort of opaque tip and a translucent base, which is unusual to get that combination. So it's the only one with the blunt tips and the taper bases. So it's not usually a difficult one to do. But there is another useful character that you can double check, which is that a feature that you'll find on to some extent on quite a few of these pondweeds is you can see the midrib here, but on either side you can sort of see these large cells. They're called air cells, or lacunae is the technical term, and in some often they help the leaf to float in the water column, and they're present in a number of species, but in this one they are particularly pronounced, particularly at the base of the leaf. If you look at the base of the leaf, often they can occupy about a third of the leaf base. So it can look as though the midrib is actually very very wide, but actually it's only this central column that's the midrib, and these are sort of bigger cells, air cells alongside. So here we are at the final box. So the leaf tips are sort of obtuse or blunt or rounded, and the leaves are stalked. And there are two in this category. They're the two that we discussed already under the opaque leafed ones. So we've got Polynesian polygynifolius, which has very long stalks, about as long as the blade, or even sometimes a bit longer. You tend to only get these before the plants have reached the surface, and they tend to rot away once there are opaque floating leaves. And they tend to be quite narrow and lanceolate. But because people are so used to seeing the bog pondweed with its opaque leaves, often people forget that it also produces these underwater leaves. So that can throw you a bit. And Coloratus, again, is the other one. The leaf stalk is usually much shorter. So compared to the leaf blade, it's sort of usually less than half. Can in the winter the leaf stalks can be a bit longer, so, but when sort of well grown in the summer, there's usually quite an obvious short leaf stalk, often broader, sort of distinctly below the middle, and the leaf stalk tends to be widest just underneath the leaf than it is at the base. There's quite an obvious tapering as you go from the leaf towards the base of the stalk. So that all sounds really easy, and it is. They're not difficult to separate, these broadleaf pondweeds. They're quite easy to do. But there is one fly in the ointment, which is that there are a number of hybrids. And hybrids and pondweeds they're not fly-by-night things. They are long persistent things that can persist in sites indefinitely, even without either the parents or with only one of the parents, and they act as sort of pseudo species because they're just so constant. For example, there is a hybrid in the River Liffey and the River Tweed, which involves the Scandinavian species Polynesian vaginatus, which no longer occurs in Britain and Ireland. Probably hasn't been in Britain and Ireland for sort of millennia, but as far as we know, it's certainly not within recorded history anyway. And there are other examples that hybrids with Polynesian lucens is quite a southern species in Britain and Ireland, and when you get to Scotland, Polynesian lucens becomes much rarer and more or less disappears, but the hybrid, particularly with Gramineus, is much more frequent. And the suggestion is that these hybrids that were formed maybe back in the Atlantic period when when the weather was warmer and lucens might have been extended further north, and as things got cooler again, the hybrids persisted, but the Polynesian lucens disappeared. There are most of the combinations. There are quite a few species that do hybridize. Most of them are quite rare, but I brought this up because there are 3 hybrids that are occasional, and so you do need to be aware of them because they can cause a bit of confusion. And basically, the hybrids are the 3 combinations: Gramineus lucens, Gramineus perfoliatus, and lucens perfoliatus. And I was just going to finish up by just discussing what to look out for these hybrids. So this is probably the most common of the hybrids, so Polynesian nitens. It's a combination of Gramineus and perfoliatus, and often looks most like Gramineus. It has these distinct stipules, short sort of rolled stipules, very typical of Gramineus, and it's got the pointed tips of the Gramineus. But if you look at the base of the leaf, you can see that it's quite rounded. You see it there. So that's where it's showing the perfoliatus parentage. So basically, most of the time, what you're looking out for is a Gramineus with a rounded base to the leaf. There are sometimes you get more hybrids that are closer to perfoliatus in appearance, so that quite a sort of oval to. It's still got a pointed tip of the Gramineus, but it's quite a sort of elliptic or sort of oval shaped leaf. And from Perfoliatus, the most obvious difference is that it's got stipules, which are persistent. And in Perfoliatus, those would disappear very quickly. The hybrid between Gramineus and Lucens is more intermediate between the parents. Probably mostly it looks closer to Lucens. It tends to be quite large leaved and glossy rather than sort of small and sort of curly like Gramineus. But the characters to look out for is that whereas Lucens has leaf stalks, the hybrid doesn't. So the leaves are completely sessile in the hybrid, and the stipules tend to be a bit shorter. They tend to be intermediate between the long stipules of Lucens and the very short pointy stipules of Gramineus. But you can also see that there's some of the curliness that's typical of Gramineus coming into the hybrid too. And finally, the final combination is Lucens and Perfoliatus. Again, it tends to have quite large leaves, similar to the Lucens, but it doesn't have has a sort of a bit more rounded base, but doesn't usually have any sort of stalk. There's possibly a hint of a stalk there, but generally it doesn't produce a stalk. So if you're finding Lucens without stalks, then you do have to consider that they might be hybrids. But again, in the hybrids, in all three of these hybrids, you can still see the pointed tips that comes from either the Gramineus or the Lucens parent. But although I've sort of just gone into these hybrids, main thing is just to get hold of the species. Species are quite easy to do, and only later sort of have a think about hybrids, but just to be aware that there are a few around, so you do need to keep an eye out for them. So there we are, not too difficult a group. Hopefully that's all clear, and just remains me to thank the BSBI for organising this, particularly Paul Green and Jim McIntosh. And to the National Parks and Wildlife, who provided financial support for the Aquatic Plants project. Any questions? Happy to answer if I can.
Thanks very much, Nick. That was brilliant. You make the broadleaf pondweed sound a bit easier to ID than most of us find. But and I was really pleased you mentioned why Potamogeton praelongus was called long-stalked pondweed, because I often get people send me photos, and because they have a leaf with a long stalk, they think they've got praelongus. So that was really good to know why. And I was glad you showed that the stalk of the on that junction on broadleaf pondweed, Potamogeton natans. It took me years to understand what they meant by that folding junction.
Yes, it's not terribly well described in some of the books, but when you see it, when you get your eye for it, it is quite obvious and pretty much always there.
So we'll start with the questions now. There's about 12 questions, I think.
Yeah, there's some great questions. But I wonder if I could get one of my own in first. Potamogeton alpinus, is it actually an alpine species? Is it found in the Alps? Do you know?
I don't know the answer to that, I'm afraid. I'd have to look that up.
Okay. I just wonder when you're speaking about it. because some of our Potawatomi are found quite high up in high lochans, up near the top of Ben Lawers, for example.
Yeah, in Britain and Ireland, it does go up a bit, but I'm trying to think where's. It's also at the softer water end of the range. Yes, I haven't discussed very much about ecology in these things. Particularly these translucent underwater leaves are quite sensitive to enrichments, and they do tell you quite a bit about the sort of the alkalinity of the water.
Okay, there's a few questions coming up about that. So,
right, okay, I'll leave that for the moment then.
Okay, so
I have to think what's the highest I've seen it Alpinus growing, and I can't think offhand that it's. But it might get quite high in the mountains, particularly not in the completely acid soft water systems. So if there's a bit of base enrichment, it might get. So some of the sort of Broad-leaved lochs might have it.
I think it might be on Meon the Tarnachem side Ben Lawers. I'd have to check on that.
Yeah.
But anyway. Going to one of our listeners or viewers' questions, Heather Garrett asks, when is the best time of year to survey these plants? You've done a great job in enthusing us all about Potamogeton and pondweeds. Now we want to go and have a look at them, but is now a great time?
It's not the best time, but there's still things to see. There are some species that are more as evergreen. I mean, certainly you can find natans and polynesian more or less throughout the winter. Polynesian crispus is evergreen, but we're on the whole we're getting towards the end of the season. One of the things about aquatic plants is that because the water takes time to heat up in the spring, the things develop more slowly than they do on that. So the season for aquatic plants tends to be delayed compared to the terrestrial plants, because also in the autumn the water's slower to cool down. But what you do find is that sort of particularly around the end of September, winds start picking up and it starts breaking things up. So generally for aquatic plant surveys, they say the end of September is the cutoff, the curfew for if you're doing surveys for official reasons. But there are some that certainly persist into October and even November if conditions are quite mild and not much sort of smaller water bodies where there isn't so much breaking up. So there is still a bit of a window to go out and have a look, and you'll see some anyway throughout the winter. But it is getting towards the end of the season.
And it would be worth folk going out if they can now and putting into practice some of their newfound knowledge and enthusiasm for pondweeds.
Absolutely.
Right, Paul, would you like to ask the next question?
Yeah, Liz MacDonald asks, habitat difference, please. Where are we most likely to find each species? I mean, that's a bit of a broad question, but...
Well, if I can probably run through fairly quickly. In general terms, Polynesian natans, virtually anywhere. It tells you very little about the ecology, except that it doesn't like being dried out, so it tends to be in permanent waters. Polynesian, on the other hand, is almost entirely a soft water species. So you will find it in little acid flushes up in the mountains quite frequently. and is often quite a shallow water species. Coloratus is actually quite a contrast to Polynesian, whereas Polynesian is in soft water. Coloratus is almost always in hard waters. So there's actually an ecological split between which can help the sort of separation of the two, except where you've got calcareous water running over acid peat. And then you can start getting problems. Come across this in one or two places in Somerset Levels, also in Anglesey, and also some places in Central Ireland where you've got a combination of hard water and acid peat. With the other ones, there tends to be a sort of a range. So Alpinus tends to be one of the ones that appears quite early when you've just got slightly more higher pH than the sort of really acid stuff in the mountains. Perfoliatus is another one that comes in quite early, and that's quite a broad ranging one, whereas Alpinus tends to be at the sort of softer end of the mesotrophic range. Lucens, on the other hand, is almost calcareous, always sort of much richer systems. Gramineus is also quite a sort of softer end of things. So in sort of the softer end of the mesotrophic range, the ones you're most likely to see are Alpinus, Gramineus, and Perfoliatus. So what are the other ones? Nodosus is it seems to be exclusively a river thing, and then quite rich rivers. Seems to be okay with a little bit of enrichment. Prelongus, sort of middle mesotrophic range, doesn't like it too rich. All of these broadleaf pondweeds tend not to be very good when enrichment starts kicking in. So they are quite sensitive to nutrient pollution. And you can see countless sites where which are now sort of rather mucky things where you look at the records in the past and think, gosh, it must have been a nice lake one time. There's lots of broadleaf pondweeds. Whereas the narrow-leaved pondweeds tend to be a bit more tolerant of nutrient enrichment. Have I covered them, all of them?
Yeah, I think so, Nick. Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, I probably should have had a bit more about the ecology, because they are quite useful indicators of sort of trophic levels, these species.
Okay, can I ask the next question? Is the pie chart of records a good representation of the currents of the two common species? So this is Polynesian polygoniferous and natans, or is ID error an issue?
Interesting you say that. I've been to some sites and thought, did they really have the other one here? I think possibly there is an element of error. I think the part of the reason is that Polynesian is much more restricted in its ecology into soft water systems, but the fact that it can be in sort of little flushes and rather than in lakes actually means that it can be, particularly sort of through the more upland areas in both Ireland and Britain, it can be sort of dotted here and there much more, because it's not restricted to larger bodies of water. But on the whole, I mean, if you were looking at England or sort of some central Ireland, sort of the lowland parts, Polynesian natans is far more common than Polygoniferous. I think the records are boosted by the upland parts of where you'll only get bottom-eaten polygynopholis.
Okay, thank you.
I'll ask you a next question. How do you preserve pondweed specimens, Nick?
Best thing is to press them. Yes, I might, in one of the talks, I might actually discuss how to press them. It becomes more important with these sort of narrow-leaved pondweeds, which tend to sort of collapse when you take them out of water. But a useful technique is to actually, with aquatic plants generally, is to float them out onto a piece of paper. So what you would do is have a tray or a basin with the pondweed floating there, and then put a piece of paper underneath, and then just lift the paper and the pondweed slowly, and let the water drain off. And the advantage of doing it that way is that if they're at all floppy, they won't all collapse and leaves all stick together. You'll get nice sort of form left, sort of arrangement on the sheet. And what you then do, so you've got a wet piece of paper with the pondweed on it. You stick that between newspaper and dry it. It'll dry quite quickly because they're quite thin. But what you will find is that they will stick to both the piece of paper that you lifted out of the water on, but also to the newspaper on top of it. So a useful tip is to use cooking parchment. If you put a sheet of cooking parchment over the top of it, it won't stick to the top. It'll stay stuck to the sheet that you mounted it on, or that you lifted it out of the water on, and you can then mount that onto a herbarium specimen if you want it as a herbarium specimen on the sheet. But to stop it sticking to the newspaper above, a bit of cooking parchment will really help with that. But generally, the best way of preserving them is to press them. And you can see all the features very clearly from press specimens.
Okay, that's great, thank you. Just a quick follow-up on the question before last from Sue. Could you confirm what you mean by hard and soft water in terms of pH?
Right, I'm using the terms hard and soft just to avoid confusion with sort of nutrient levels. So basically, soft waters are sort of low pH, below 7 pH, and low in lime content. Sort of hard waters are sort of pH is sort of well up in the 7s to 8s, and calcareous waters rather than necessarily. Calcareous and acid is a different sort of spectrum to oligotrophic and eutrophic, but sometimes they're used rather interchangeably and not very precisely. So I tend to prefer to use soft and hard when I'm talking about sort of pH and oligotrophic and eutrophic when talking about nutrients.
Okay, thanks. Paul?
Thank you, Nick. Martin Rand asks, does Possum Coloratus have leaves that always struck me as having strongly lattice appearance? This is a fair assumption?
It is. Yes, it often has quite a sort of checkered pattern to the leaf. That's very typical of it, particularly the underwater leaves. Less so when they start going opaque, but yes, that's quite a typical sort of pattern of it, and more so than in Polynesian.
Yes, a couple of points here. I think probably we need to start wrapping it up. We've had over 20 minutes of questions, which is fantastic. there's still a few questions unanswered, but most of them we've covered. But just 2 points I would like to cover. Roger asks, I missed the beginning, will we be able to watch again? And the answer to that is yes, we'll upload the recording of the video to the BSBI Aquatic Plant Project YouTube channel, playlist rather. And the other question along similar lines is Mike Jenkins asks, will we be doing a similar webinar for narrow-leaved pondweeds? Well, we haven't spoken about that, Nick, but it would be fantastic if we could do that next year in next year's Aquatic Plant Project. Wouldn't you agree?
Yes, absolutely. No, there's definitely, this is Pondweeds Part 1, and we'll have a sequel sometime in the near future.
Excellent.
And the hope is to actually cover some of the other groups sort of bit by bit, cover some of the other aquatic plant groups. There's already one on water crowfoots, on water starworts, and on stoneworts. But there are other groups to cover, which people do seem to be finding these useful. So the intention is to keep going with them.
Great. Okay, that was great, Nick. Thank you very much. Paul, would you like to wrap up?
Yeah, thanks very much, Nick. That sort of covered a really broad range, including Ireland and lots of parts of the UK. And I think it made a lot of things a lot clearer even to someone like me who've been doing botany for 30 odd years. So that's been really useful. I should go out this afternoon and see if I can practice some of what you've taught me.